Thank you. My name is Nik Green. With me is Dr. Hera Cook. We are two of the three original co-founders of Gun Control New Zealand. You have all our submissions material. We'd like to make a few introductory comments, one on the overall submission, some points on vetting, and then we'll get into the questions. Our overall comment, I think, is that we welcome the bill. Although there are areas where we would like to see some changes, we think this is the sort of law we need now and that New Zealand really should have had 25 to 30 years ago. It's pretty heartbreaking that it's taking something like Christchurch to force action, but it's positive that we're taking a comprehensive approach here because that's what the research suggests is needed to improve gun safety. There are some specific elements of the bill that we have highlighted in our submission, which I'd like to reiterate here. The first is that we welcome the introduction of a new purpose statement, which prioritises public safety and clarifies that gun ownership is a privilege and not a right. This provides clearer signals to the court and will help the police to more effectively enforce the law. Second, we welcome the introduction of universal registration. We know from the stats the two main ways in which guns fall into criminal hands is through theft and through the unscrupulous transfer of firearms by licence holders. The introduction of registration in Australia reduced gun thefts by 85%. Conversely, when Canada got rid of its long gun register, theft rates went up. Third, we welcome the proposal to shorten the licence period. New Zealand's 10-year licence period is very long by international standards, and it doesn't adequately control for changes in the circumstances of licence holders. Our preference is for a 3-year term as per the Thorpe review, but if the committee prefers to stick with the proposed 5-year term, we'd recommend that shorter terms be applied to applicants aged under 30. It's clear from the police RIS that this group poses a much higher risk in terms of criminal offending, is not consistently law-abiding, and is hence worthy of closer scrutiny. Fourth, we welcome the identification in law of the criteria for a fit and proper test and for criteria that would automatically disqualify the gaining of a licence. In our view, the automatic disqualification criteria should be expanded to include people who are members of a gang or an organised crime group and people who have convictions for behaviour that promotes violence, hatred and extremism. We also consider that the criteria which indicate someone may not be fit and proper should be expanded to include offences that demonstrate a reckless disregard for the safety of others. We support the proposed introduction of a firearms advisory group that would represent the broader public. The voice of firearms owners is clearly important here, but gun safety is an issue that affects the wider community, and so it's appropriate that all voices are heard. And finally, we welcome the tighter controls on ammunition sales, but we believe the bill could go further and that should record ammunition sales on the register and limit sales of ammunition to that which is compatible with a registered firearm. That would provide stronger incentives for everyone to register all firearms and will make it harder for owners of illicit guns to access ammunition.
Thank you. I'm going to speak to, we put in an additional submission with comments on vetting. Vetting appears nowhere in the legislation, not in this proposed bill, and not even in the 1992 regulations. However, many people, I think, regard this as the absolute linchpin of the New Zealand firearms licensing system. We strongly support the continuation of face-to-face, in-person interviews with applicants in their homes and, where possible, with their spouse or next of kin in their home. And the interviews with the referees frequently seem to be carried out by phone. We think that might be acceptable if it's worked. We'd like to see more research into the vetting process as well as continuation of the vetting process. We believe that online vetting contributes considerably less information. It also does not build trust in the same way. It does not permit the firearms storage to be examined in an atmosphere of mutual trust and rapport created by a long interview. We believe that modernisation of vetting should consist of the introduction of tools such as iPads, regular and proper training of the vetters. In the past, the vetters have in fact received no training. The training that they brought with them from their prior occupations was considered to be adequate. And we think there should be regular two-way communication between police and the vetters, that the vetters should be seen as a link between police and the firearms community. We strongly support the idea that there is a firearms community and that they are potentially highly responsible and an asset to our community. We note that there's a lot of interaction. One of the things we've seen in the research that we've undertaken and in our encounters with people is that there genuinely is an enormous amount of interaction between people who are firearm owners and other people in the New Zealand community. And we think that that should continue and that that's a really positive aspect that police should encourage through more activities of the kind that are involved in their going into rural Māori communities and supporting the obtaining of licences in those communities. We also think that the interview with the spouse acknowledges the high rates of family violence in New Zealand and the importance of women as having a role in the way that our firearms culture operates. That interview shows respect for women's opinions in an otherwise almost totally male-dominated activity. The other thing we have asked for, which is not in the legislation, is a lower age limit for children. There are some people who are very prominent firearms users in New Zealand who have said publicly that they have taught their child to use a firearm at the age of 3. It is very common for these people to talk about children starting to use firearms at the age of 5 or 6. We believe this is too young. We think the reason that there are not more accidents and injuries to children is our storage regulations, and that's good. But the influence of these ideas is pernicious. We believe that 13 and over is an appropriate age for people to start being trained in the use of firearms and handling firearms, and that those aged 12 and under should not be using firearms, whether supervised by a licensed firearms owner or not. And we draw the committee's attention to other activities like riding quad bikes, using fireworks, and so on, where our ideas of what is appropriate have been tightened very considerably over recent decades.
Yeah, let's not doing anything.
Okay, the order I have is me, David Seymour, Clayton, Brett, Kitty, Andrew, if we get through that slide. I just wonder, in light of just the previous submission, which I know you heard, if you could speak to us a little about what you see as the value that a register of all firearms would create.
Well, the main point, as we said before, is increases accountability for the safe storage of firearms. We've had a number of instances in the press where people have left their guns unlocked in a car and these have been stolen. If you are accountable for each individual gun, you are going to be taking better care of it. But the evidence from both the Canadian and the Australian experience shows that it makes a direct difference to theft rates, which helps stem the flow of firearms to criminal hands. I know I imagine there's been a lot of commentary about the Canadian experience in some of your previous submissions. A lot of the numbers there have been taken out of context. They refer to the entire firearms reform process. The actual cost of running the register towards the end were down around the 2 to 4 million per annum range and was found to be cost effective in a later evaluation. So these things can be made to work. Obviously, the greater the coverage, the better, but they don't need to be perfect to be effective.
I'd also like to add that the firearms, the representations from firearms users frequently refer to evidence that comes from the 1990s or even earlier, and that obviously we have increased enormously our capacity to run large computerized databases effectively.
It is also worth pointing out there are some specific features around the Canadian experience which we can avoid. Some of the things that contributed to cost overruns were setting up a new agency that had no experience. There are issues around the whole federal interaction in Canada that we don't have here. And of course, there's the US border and the problem of smuggling of guns, which we don't face. So it's quite a different situation.
Thank you. David.
Yes, thank you for your submission. I'm just interested in your commentary that you didn't want to see children under 12 utilising firearms. What's the basis for that? Are children under 12 committing gun crime, or are they forming habits that lead them to commit gun crime? What was your evidential basis?
As we all know, children develop and mature, and parents spend a great deal of effort and energy, as do teachers, in assessing the capacity of children to engage in various activities as simple as crossing a road, for example. Now, when we look at the decisions that were made around quad bikes, the decision was made that, and also when we look at, sorry, I should say this is also another instance where the USA provides us with a litany of tragedies, where there really are disasters in terms of children not being strong enough to hold firearms, to manage the recoil, there are disasters where children, the gun safety training that has been widely promoted by the National Rifle Association has been very thoroughly assessed by researchers and has been found not to prevent children from picking up firearms or doing things with them. It's really a question of the maturity that we think of. And I think that when we think about what are the activities that we normally permit children to engage in. And I think the reason, as I said, I think in my original comment, the reason we haven't had a lot of disasters, I suspect, is that most parents do not actually allow their children to use firearms at a young age because they're not using firearms at all.
But I guess the purpose of my question is that you promote yourselves as being evidence-based and focused on public safety. So you've just spoken for quite a long time, but it's not clear what problem you're trying to solve with this particular position. In fact, at the end of your answer, you seem to concede that there isn't a problem you're trying to solve. It's just a personal view.
I think we're looking forward to a problem because what we're having is a heavy promotion of children's use of firearms by people who claim to be responsible and law-abiding firearms owners. And that this is another instance where we should actually be getting in ahead of the curve before we have the impact of those kinds of attitudes.
Right. So your final position is that you are in favour of restricting anybody under 12 from using a firearm under parental supervision because you think there might be a future problem.
I think because there are problems in other countries, in fact, that we can use evidence from elsewhere.
Okay, I've got Clayton and then Brett, we might be out of time.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a couple of questions. The first question is around the establishment of Gun Control New Zealand. I mean, it's great we've got the co-founders here. How long have you had your organisation set up?
May, I believe.
We formally incorporated in May, and we got together and decided to do this in April. So this was very much a response to what had happened in Christchurch.
And have you had any direct involvement with firearms? Are you a hunter? Have you ever used a firearm? Have you ever?
I myself was involved in a lotteries-funded research project through 2017 and 18 because we were concerned about the firearms law in New Zealand. I don't accept the premise of your question, which is that people who do not have direct experience of using firearms do not have a capacity.
No, he didn't
to
say that. He just said no.
What involvement
Just answer the question.
I mean, you talk about evidence-based, and I acknowledge that. But you also talk about reducing the licensing age time frames from 10 years down to 3 years, and you talk about evidence. But have you got evidence that you can show that that is actually going to reduce any potential harm or have fixing to a problem, or is it just something that you feel philosophically that this will have an impact, or is it actually evidence-based?
In terms of those aged under 30, they are shown in the research impact statement not to be law-abiding.
There was a 10-year licensing. You said you want to reduce it down to 3. What evidence?
Excuse me, I'm just getting to that. We think that because of the changes in what is happening to those young people in that period of their lives, it would be more appropriate to have a shorter licensing period. We also have an issue at the other end of the licensed firearms owners group, which is with older people. Over 50% of licensed firearm owners are now over 50. We know that capacity declines at a certain point and that we have no system at all for moving firearms out of the hands of those who are getting. I'm sorry, I don't have data on the top age group. But we do have, I'm sorry, we have rising rates of dementia. We have problems with cognitive decline. We need to actually make sure that we have a system for removing firearms from people who are no longer competent to manage them.
You've answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for Brett.
Okay, thank you very much. Have you had any discussions with any ministers or government officials about being members of the proposed firearms advisory group?
No.
No.
Okay, you made a comment about keeping guns out of criminals' hands and what have you. Are you aware of the evidence received by the Law and Order Select Committee in the 2016-17 inquiry into firearms possession that 90% of firearms used in criminal offences in Australia which has a register are unregistered?
Oh,
That can't be true.
I think the overall, Can you
It is
speak to
true.
the overall
Oh.
decline in offences?
I mean,
in
you will
Australia?
see in our submission the impact on mass shootings that the National Firearms Committee has
I'm
had.
talking specifically about the evidence from Australia that was received by that committee.
We're talking about the evidence for the impact of the reform of firearm law in Australia after Port Arthur, which was that while there may well be, we all know that there are a considerable number of non-registered firearms in New Zealand as well as in Australia, and we've also seen evidence of use of non-registered firearms in the
But what that
UK.
data does show is
But
that.
what I would like to suggest is
the
that what
register.
that shows is that as we go on maintaining a register, we will gradually
It didn't work in Australia.
move those.
So what it does show
Excuse me,
is that
it
it
did
won't
work
keep
in
the
Can we
hands.
just, Brett, would you like to carry on?
What it does show, I would contend, is that having a register does not keep firearms out of criminal hands. 10% of offences involving firearms are registered, the firearms are registered. A tiny proportion of the firearms offences. So the register, I contend, in Australia, it's been in effect for some years, is not doing anything to either keep guns out of criminal hands to any great substance or to
Well, except
prevent
reduce
crime.
the incidence of mass shootings, which is a pretty important impact.
What are the definitions of mass shooting used in Australia?
Well, in the evidence, it's 5 or more where the perpetrator was not killed.
And they're not known to them, all right? So what if it's a family shooting? Could be multiple persons, but it's not classed as mass shooting.
New Zealand's not free of those either.
What if we take them out? What if we include them?
Oh, we're at time, so I think we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your submission. Thank you for coming in today.